Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar presentation via the Edi Black Range Catchment Group. We've got Sally Day here, a local project officer, who's going to be speaking to us about managing gully erosion. Over to you, Sally. Thank you.
Thanks, Penny. Hoping everybody can see those overheads there. Now, just wanted to run through today. Thanks for inviting me along to speak to you all. So the group has asked me to speak on managing gully erosion, and it's something that's, I'll try and be really concise. It's a topic that we could probably talk for a couple of hours about, but we're going to go through the basics today, try and help you understand what the causes of gully erosion are, the different types of erosion that can contribute to forming a gully, what the impacts are on your productivity and biodiversity. How do we manage them? My key take-home message is prevention is better than cure. Different ways in which to monitor erosion sites and strategies for actually managing them with some practical gully erosion control options that we'll run through at the end. So I've got lots of photos to try and demonstrate points today, and also we have some short little YouTube movies to watch as well. All right, let's get started. So what causes erosion? So in its simplest form, it's energy from water that's working against the binding forces of soil to actually dislodge and remove soil from the soil surface. So energy in the form of rain or flowing water across the surface of the soil. If the impact of that and the energy of that movement is stronger than the capacity of the soil to hold on to bits of particles, then bits of particles get carried away in the water. So there's a lot of different things that influence the rate of movement of soil. So soil type, the slopes, so how steep your land is in your property, where you are in the catchment, whether you're at the headwaters, at the upstream end on the more sloping country, or whether you're down on the flat section of the catchment, what the vegetation cover is at the site, whether we have good grass cover, or whether you have a good cover of leaf litter, whether you have trees and shrubs, that can all influence the rate of erosion, and what the land use is can be a big influence on the rate of erosion as well, primarily because that affects what the vegetation cover is at the site. All right, so these I've sort of broken down. There's actually quite a lot of different types of erosion, and they all contribute to different physical features at a site. So we've got splash erosion, sheet erosion, rill erosion, gully erosion, tunnel erosion, bed and bank erosion, wind erosion, and mass movement. So sometimes we'll have one site that will encapsulate all different sorts of this. And I'm just going to show you some brief photos to explain each of those types of erosion and how they may impact on sites at your property. So splash erosion is just basically the impact of raindrops on bare soil. So you've got uncovered soil and you have drops of rain that hit, and what it does is basically detaches particles that then bounce off or flow away. So on a flat soil surface, you might not lose those particles. On a sloping soil surface, as we can see here, as the rain hits, just the impacts of gravity, action of gravity will carry particles down the slope and they'll be removed. So often you'll get these sort of really fine sediments deposited in the bottoms of your channel or your little rill line, and that's quite often on bare slopes like this. It's just the impact of rain splash. So sheet erosion is, when we refer to that, it's really the movement of soil from thin layers right across the surface, and again triggered by movement because of rain or flowing water, but it happens in much larger spaces. So the whole of this slope, when it rains, all of that material just washes down into that lower section of the little drainage line. Rill erosion, everyone would be probably quite familiar with the structures of rill and the presentation of it. So you get these little lines that run down slope, and basically it's often happens in really dispersible soils, and it's just the impact of that rain and water moving across the soil surface and carrying lots of particles with it. So you get these long, thin lines of soil that sort of form. And it can lead to the formation of gullies if you're in these sites with really dispersible and uncohesive soils. So tunnel erosion occurs where water actually is seeping through the subsoil and starts to erode some of that material from the subsoil underneath the surface. So often it can be triggered by holes that are caused by rabbits. Rabbits are really good at starting tunnel erosion. But if you're in these areas with really dispersive soils, it can be just the natural, the natural movement of the flow of water through the surface, which is removing material. And over time, these tunnels get bigger and bigger. And then that can lead to collapse of the material above and the formation of quite a pronounced gully. So when we talk about dispersive soils, these are soils that don't have any cohesion. So if you were to try and grab some of that bank and roll it in your hand, it just crumbles into a mix of sort of sand and silt and clay. And a good way to test if your soil is dispersive is actually to break off a crumb of the soil off the bank and drop it in a small glass of water and watch what happens. And you could compare that to a small bit of soil from your veggie garden that you know has quite high organic matter loads, and watch how they behave in the glass. And you'll see the one with the dispersive soil, it just falls apart in water. It has nothing that holds it and binds it together, where the soil from the veggie garden that should have more organic matter, probably a bit more clay, it will stay together potentially in a block in the cup for a lot longer before it starts to break apart. So that's a good test for you to see what sort of behaviour you have with your soils. So bed and bank erosion, I think most of us are pretty familiar with this. It's really the removal of material either from the bottom of the waterway or from the banks. And we could have a 2-hour session just talking about the processes of bed and bank erosion, because it is quite complex on river systems. But the important thing to note is that often what we see happening first is the bed of the waterway will start to deepen in response to some other changes in the catchment, whether that's been vegetation clearance or a flood. So as we see on this photo here of Burgoyne Creek, the bed of the waterway has got quite deep through the middle. And then in response, what happens is we start to get collapse or erosion from the bank. So sometimes it'll be direct flowing water over the bank surface, which will remove and erode the outside bank. And sometimes it's just that the weight and the steepness of the banks gets too much, and we get what we call like mass movement or block collapse, where material actually falls straight in. So there's a whole lot of different erosion processes here, but it is important to think of them separate. So when we have erosion in the bed versus erosion in the banks, we manage them a little bit differently, and we have to look at what the processes are that are affecting them. So when this is a really common photo, if you have a prolonged flow at one flow level, you'll get this, what we call notching on the bank. This can happen in a gully as well. So you'll get just constant movement of water at one flow height, which removes all the material at that flow height. And then what happens is the weight of the soil above that point gets so heavy that the whole block just falls into the creek. So we call that mass movement or block collapse. Now, this is a very fine silty clay. This is over at Bowman's Forest, and it's got very little cohesion. So it doesn't take much flow for water to actually start to form those features. So when we start to talk about the impacts of erosion, it can have an impact on your property in various different ways. So for me, at the top of the list, it's that loss of valuable topsoil. And that's really critical to your farming enterprise, because once you lose that valuable topsoil, which has all the organic matter and the nutrients in that, what happens is you start to expose the poorer subsoils underneath, and they are going to be usually harder clays. They might be much more difficult to get pasture established in, and they can also be those really dispersive subsoil clays like I've shown photos of now. So once we lose that protective cap and that layer of good topsoil off the top, we risk opening up our land to have these poor clay and possibly dispersive subsoils underneath, and that's when it becomes very difficult to manage. So that's probably, I think, a really important one from a productivity point of view. Obviously, when you start to get large-scale gullies and bank erosion happening on your property, you risk losing areas of land as rivers move and as gullies get bigger. So that's a direct loss of productive land, which is obviously really critical. From an infrastructure point of view, often we cite things like pump sheds on outside bends of rivers, and sometimes we'll have tracks quite close to gullies. We might have fence lines that are built too close to gullies or rivers. So, direct damage to farm infrastructure can cost you money in terms of replacing infrastructure, and it is something that is a real risk on a lot of properties. The other sort of less thought about impact, I think, is that we can also generate pretty large volumes of sediment coming out of these gullies. And if you have a dam downstream of these gullies, all of that sediment is going to end up straight in your dam or in the waterway, that's the receiving waterway that's at the downstream end. So if you have to get equipment in to desilt your dams regularly, that's going to come at a cost to you. And also, it's not easy to quantify the impacts on biodiversity, but if we have big slugs of sediment moving downstream through our gullies and waterways, that actually starts to fill in all the valuable fish habitat. So all the deep pools and all of the nice, beautiful in-stream features that we have in our rivers, like the King and the Ovens River. If we start to get a lot of sediment come in, we start to fill all those features up, and that removes a lot of breeding and habitat areas for our local fish. So just in terms of how gullies form and migrate, we'll show you a little movie in a second, but the basic concept that everybody needs to understand is that head cuts will always work their way upslope and in an upstream direction. So you'll get these waterfall features that basically form, and that's what we call is a head cut. So the rate of movement of that erosion feature on the gully, that head cut, really depends on how steep the slope is and the energy of the water, so, and the soil type. So there's really three factors that come into play when we start to look at how quickly these features can move. And I'm just going to show you that the first movie, just around head cut migration and how these work. So this is a movie that's been taken by Brad Costin from Agriculture Victoria, and he's been able to allow us to share this today, which is fantastic. So we should have a clip up now of this is what we call a head cut on a gully. And I'm just going to press play. It only goes for a minute, just so that we can see what the action is of the flowing water over that head cut and how it's moving. So this is an upstream direction to the top of the page, and as the water comes down over this gully head, it's picking up material at the surface here and removing more material, allowing that head cut to move in an upstream direction. So you'll get all the finer sediment gets deposited in the base of these gullies as it washes off the sides and as it moves from the top. So obviously this is quite a small rainfall event, but you can see how much water these systems generate. Great. All right. Well, we'll stop there and we'll go back to our presentation. Let me just grab that. Okay. Now, share screen again. Sorry, this is technically challenging. Sorry, everyone. Okay.
I'll let you know when it appears.
Can you confirm? I don't think I've got it yet.
No, not yet. Here we go.
All right. I don't think you've got the right screen, but anyway, we'll grab that. Sorry. Okay. Have we got a slide up saying valley fill?
Yep, we're all good.
Great. Okay. So I just wanted to show you an example of a really small gully starting to form in a paddock. So we call these flat wide sections in our valleys valley fill. And what that basically is the material over time that's washed off from the sloping country around deposits in the base of these little drainage lines. And so it's often very fine silts and sandy materials, depending on what the predominant soil type is up above. But basically, they're very fine deposits that sit here. And the vegetation that grows in these valleys, like the rushes and sedges, hold and bind that together. So it's not a very strong cohesive material. So once you get that action of flowing water over the surface, if you start to remove your cover, you can start to get these little nick points or head cuts form in areas of these fills. And they're very quick to erode and prone to erode. This is a zoomed in photo at the same point. So these are these small little head cuts beginning to form where the action of flowing water is removing material. And this is a site that had stock access all through it. And so as stock walk through these wet, boggy areas, they start to break away more material and create more bare ground. And that exacerbates this beginning of these gullies. So gullies will always start small, and the trick is to get onto them early before they get to a state where it's really hard to intervene and manage them. So once they get to this point and you've got these sorts of volumes of water flowing over them, it becomes a really costly exercise to manage them. And you're looking at needing to have a proper physical structure in there to protect the bank, to allow water to flow from the high point down into the low point of the gully or the bed of the gully. So really, the earlier we can get on and prevent these from forming, the better. So the four major influences on energy of flow. So energy is your big driver for how serious the erosion can end up on your property, is the speed at which the water flows over these areas, so over these gullies or on your drainage lines. So the faster it flows, the more energy it has, the more capacity it has to remove material. The cover, so how much grass you have on those slopes, or I also call it the roughness. So if we think of all those little blades of grass, a bit like bristles on a brush, they're slowing water down as it hits that grass all the time. So the more grass we have, the more roughness we have, the more that can slow the flow down, which reduces the impact of the water across that soil surface. So the third point here is the amount of water that we have. So if you're in a very small catchment versus a very large catchment, you're going to have a lot more water. The more flow you have, the more depth you have, the more energy you're going to have through that across that surface. And slope is the other fourth influence. So the steeper that the slope is, the faster that the water will flow down the slope, the more energy that it has. So all four of these influences are really tightly connected, really. So, slope and the amount of water determines the speed as well. So you've got a few things that are interdependent here, but really, I just want everyone to consider that it's all about the energy of the water that flows through these sites, which is your determination on how much your potential erosion is. So catchment size is a big factor to consider when we're treating these sites. So if we're in a really small catchment, we can get away with a small, a small little structure or some bales of lucerne that might treat it, and that might be enough. As we get bigger catchments, our volume of flow gets greater, and our risk of damage and our risk of erosion goes up a lot. And that's when we need to start looking at more robust solutions. So guidelines for managing gullies, I think I've said this a couple of times already, prevention is always better than cure. So if we can get on to treat these sites early, they're going to be much simpler to look at, much less costly to fix, and much easier to fix with more certainty. So the risk is a lot less. Once we get really big gully erosion heads, we're looking at big dollars to fix them. So let's get in and treat the sites early before our problems escalate. Now, vegetation is the key to these sites, certainly in prevention. Maintaining cover at 70% or more is really important. The binding capacity of roots of trees and shrubs is really important. And vegetation also provides organic matter to the soil and can have influences on soil chemistry. So all of that comes into play, meaning that your soil is less, more resistant to erosion and less likely to be removed. So really important to manage stocking rates to avoid overgrazing and bearing out areas of ground in susceptible areas. And so on your drainage lines, really we need to be looking at keeping ground cover as high as we can. 70% would be a minimum. And using deep-rooted perennial species in those areas gives you much greater soil binding capacity. So that's where our sedges and rushes come into play. They're native, they do really well in those areas, and they're areas on your property that you should be retaining them. So managing wet areas appropriately is a really important one, because that's where a lot of these gullies start, in these wet areas. So like the smaller photo that I showed earlier, if we can keep stock out of those sensitive areas just during the wet months, then that stops a lot of these features beginning to develop. So something I'm really passionate about is trying to encourage people to retain rushes and sedges on their drainage lines and on their creeks and on their waterways. We all know that they're not productive out in the paddock, out on the floodplain where you need to grow your pasture species. So removing them in areas like that is fine. But on drainage lines like this small creek over at Tarrawingi, they provide really important soil binding capacity. So there's not a lot of rushes through this bed, but I wanted to just share this photo because there was these single clumps of rushes, or they're actually sedges, they're actually kerricks that are remaining, that were built up about 30 or 40 centimetres above the bed of the creek. And so every time I found a sedge in this creek, there was actually, it was binding all this material together and had stopped more being eroded. So if we had a full cover of these across the bed of this creek would have coped with high flows a lot better, and we wouldn't have had that bed deepening that we've had happening through this system. So before we actually start to assess what we need to do to repair and potentially fix an erosion site, it's really important for us to consider a few key questions about those sites. So the first one is, how much is your head cut moving? So sometimes sites can look really bad. They can be quite raw. There's not a lot of vegetation on the banks, but they may not have moved for 5 or 10 years or 20 years. So they might be basically an example of an old site that is now stabilised, and although it looks ugly, it might not be moving further. So the first thing is to establish how much is it moving per year, and I think that's really important. So to do that, a really easy way to do that is to establish an erosion peg at a site. So what you can do is put a fence post just, 2-3 meters upstream of the gully, drive in a star picket, or if you've got a nearby fence post, and you just use a tape measure and measure off that point to the top of the gully each time, like do it a couple of times a year, maybe before and after winter. And that'll allow you to actually record how much that bank, that head cut is moving upstream at each time that you go out. So that's a really simple way to see if that's moving. The other way that you can do it is to take regular photographs from the same point and compare photographs over time, because it might be that it's not moving so much, and we can do some basic remediation at the site to start, do some planting. So, but we don't need to, intervene to actually do some stabilisation works. So the other thing is to go out during the rain and actually have a look at how these sites function and look at what type of erosion is present at the site. So if you've got, subsoil moisture and tunnelling, you can look at the rate of material coming out during a rainfall event. You can see where the dominant areas are at the site that's carrying water through it. So some of it might be just bank erosion because the banks are steep and they've fallen in, but there might not actually be any water flowing over those. And there's other features that we can look for at these sites, which will start to tell us if the site is beginning to repair itself. So if you start to get sedges and rushes growing and grass in the bottom of these gullies, and sometimes we even get seed that's blown in from nearby trees or shrubs, like you might get some river bottlebrush growing in the bottom, or just some red gum, depending on where you are. If you're starting to get germination of plants, grasses, trees in the bottom, that's a really good sign that that's not still lowering and that that's actually a bit more stable. So having a good look at the features after a rainfall event, do you get little pools of sediment or fresh material that's washing in behind logs? So there's little things to look at closely at those sites that will tell you whether the site is starting to repair and stabilise itself over time. And our landscapes do have great capacity for repair if we give them the right conditions to allow them to do it. So once you've done some monitoring and you think that you may have a problem, we probably need to look at what are the options for managing that gully. So I've tried to break this into separate, there's about 4 stages for us to look at here in detail. So the first one that I've suggested is to look at reducing the volume of surface runoff from upstream. So if you can reduce the water that's coming down through your site, the amount of water, you can reduce the potential for erosion at that gully. So the different ways, some of the ideas that I had around how you might be able to do that is that you can increase water use and absorption in the paddocks above your gully, and that might be through pasture selection and management. So retain more grass cover, particularly over winter when these sites are most susceptible, and maybe change species from an annual to a deep-rooted perennial in the paddock immediately upstream of your gully to increase water use. You can look at planting trees in recharge areas on ridges to use more water up so that you haven't got as much water coming down the slope. And there are some physical actions that we can take, like doing contouring or keyline ploughing across the slope to encourage the infiltration of water into our subsoil. So rather than getting surface runoff where the water comes in sheets across our paddocks, actually trying to increase absorption in the paddock as much as possible. And I guess the fourth option here, it's an expensive one, is to construct a new dam to capture more water upstream. But there are obviously permits and requirements that are triggered by that if you want to go down that path. So just a couple of photos for you. So this is a gully, which I would say it's a historical gully. It's quite stable now. It's got reasonable grass cover all the way through it. When I look upstream of this point, there's actually a forested ridge line. So we can't really plant any more trees upstream of this site. But what we can do is manage the grass cover at this site to maximise infiltration. Here's another, and this is actually the view looking upstream. So this is all the trees upstream of that gully. So water's actually coming out of a really forested ridge line. So we can't do any more planting. What we need to do is actually manage cover as much as possible and not overgraze this gully. So in most cases, that can be done really simply by fencing either side of it and just allowing it to grass up and keeping stock off it permanently. And that will give you, a great amount of vegetation to slow water and increase absorption. So I also mentioned contours and keyline ploughing before. This is an old photo from the Department of Primary Industries in 2004. And this is some contouring that was done across slope to sort of spread water to avoid the concentration of water just into the gully. So what this aims to do is to assist that we spread our infiltration over a much larger area rather than getting concentrated runoff. So my second point is really to spread water to reduce concentration so that, the contours that I just showed you. If you're going to go down that path of doing some contours, you do need to be careful of where that water gets distributed to avoid creating problems elsewhere. So it has to be done with good consideration of levels and looking at your slopes so that basically you're trying to spread water across ridge lines rather than concentrating into gullies. So it is a feature of keyline systems and natural sequence farming. So you can do a bit of Googling on that if you're looking for more information about contouring. So you can also increase your vegetation and your roughness to slow flow and increase filtration. So we just talked about that. So more deep-rooted perennial grasses, and certainly retaining sedges and rushes on your drainage lines for stability is just a really simple way to start to help them. Fencing, as I mentioned, fence to protect your sensitive areas. Keep cattle out of them in winter, and maybe allow them in to graze in summer when that ground is firm and hard and they can't do any damage and soil disturbance, during those wetter months. So here's a small drainage line. The gully that's on the backside of these trees is about 6 meters deep, and it's super substantial. It's in really dispersive soils over at Bowman's Forest. There's only the drainage line upstream of this point is not that big, and there's only a few rushes in it, and there's probably only 15 meters between this fence line and where this big 6 meter deep gully head is sitting. Now, if that continues to move up through here, you've got a huge volume of sediment that's going to end up in the dam that's down the bottom, and then in the receiving waterway, which is actually Begoygi Creek and then the Ovens River. So, managing these gullies here to have as much vegetation upstream of them as possible is really important. So if we've already looked at reducing runoff from upstream and spreading the water to reduce the concentration at the gully heads, and we've still got a problem, the third thing that we're going to have to do, or the third option here, is actually to address those active head cuts at the site. So the various ways that we can do that. So first and foremost, and this should be a given every time you have a gully, immediately fence it from stock and allow it to grass up. That's a cheap way to fix a problem before it gets worse. So whack up a fence, establish deep-rooted vegetation at the site. So what we've probably learnt from our earlier plantings in the 90s is if we plant too close with our trees and shrubs, we actually shade the ground cover and we lose all our grass, which is actually counterproductive. So what we need to do here is have a balance of deep-rooted trees, because the roots bind soil together in the subsoil and at depth, but we also need to maintain grass cover. So not a really dense planting, we need to allow light in. So you might put trees and shrubs, you might space them 5 meters apart, for example. So avoid overplanting, but get vegetation growing at that site. And then the third point, and this is where the expense starts to kick in, is to construct structures of various types to actually address the head cut. And I'm just going to take you through some of the various options for doing that. This is a little photo of Bowman's Forest. So the hills around Bowman's Forest. This is a ridge line across the top, and you can see that trees have been retained on the ridge, which is really good. But all these little lines here are all the waterways flowing off this steep country. And these are gully erosion sites that were fenced and planted sort of 20 years ago and have successfully halted gully erosion at a lot of these properties. So there's a few things, as I've just talked about. So here's a site where we've got a dam constructed upstream of a gully head. Another one here, we've got another dam here that would be reducing some of the water flow through here. But basically, fencing and re-veg is a really cheap way to start addressing these sites. And I would encourage that that's everyone's first port of call before we look to do more expensive structures. So at the cheapest end of things, bales of lucerne make great, great tools that are going to last for a couple of years at your site without problem. So bale of lucerne is about $10. Get some wooden stakes. You can use some star pickets. I'm going to show you a little clip in a minute about installing those properly at your site. But basically you're looking to push them right up into the head cut. And this site hasn't been done so well. That should run all the way around the head cut. And over time, that'll just break down and start to catch sediment and material and hopefully grow over with grass. So bales of straw or lucerne are a really cheap way to start. Then we start to look at other things that we can find on our property. So brushing, what I call brushing, is basically the ends or the heads of trees, so little branches. So you've got the stem of a branch in the green material, and what you can actually do is lay them down slope. So the stick part of the branch is actually heading upstream, and the head of the tree you lay downstream. And what you can do is just layer those over the site, working in an upstream direction. And then you can use logs or you can use anything heavy that sort of holds that in place. You can drive some timber star pickets through, timber pickets, star pickets, anything that holds that in place and secures that. And what we call this as a brush ramp, but basically it's adding a whole lot of coarse woody material to your site, which slows water, catches sediment, and over time hopefully will grass up and form a natural sort of, feature to help that flow get from this high level down here. So the first step is sort of to level that and smooth that back, and then construct your brushing over the top, and then tie some logs or use some, star pickets or timber to actually secure the material. Another way, this is a little bit more expensive, there's these Terralock geofabric bags. So you can buy these bags online from various manufacturers. I think they're about $5 a bag. And then you deliver them to site and basically start to fill them with sand, close them up, and they form like a movable brick, if you like, that you can layer around your site to build like a ramp that allows water to flow over the surface. So the geofabric is a special type of very fine fabric, and the sand from the bag won't be able to wash it out. The beauty of using these is that they're really portable. They're something that you can carry into a site. So if you've got a lot of trees, like this photo shows, you can sort of custom fit a small structure to work at a site without having to get machinery in. So you could have a wheelbarrow, some bags, some sand nearby, and just carry them in and out until you've built your structure. Another option is doing a rock flume, or like a little mini rock chute. So this flume has got some little wings, I guess, at the top, and then this has all been hand placed, so there's no machinery involved in doing this. So if you've in parts of our hillier parts of our country where we've got rock scattered through, you might be able to start to pick up some local rock out of your paddock that you can use to build a structure like this. So everything's hand placed here. There's a layer of geofabric underneath, and what you're looking for is rock of a range of sizes that will interlock and form a nice protective surface for you. So it's basically building a small rock ramp, and you can see at the finished photo in the bottom right, it protects part of the bank upstream and grades that down into the lower level of the gully. When we start to increase in scale with really large gullies, then you are going to need to get an experienced machinery operator in to place rock to build a rock chute for you at a site. So if we're going to build a rock chute properly, we actually would be looking to key rock, dig a trench for rock at the upstream end, and what we call is we key that rock in to form the crest of the rock chute, and then we grade that chute. I think it's, you don't want it any steeper than 1 to 5, and then you would have a rock apron at the bottom end of the chute where we actually extend the rock downstream through the bed for a little distance below the structure. And that's just to make sure that the action of the flowing water over that surface doesn't pick up any material at the bottom of the rock chute and carry it away. So starting to get pretty expensive when we look at rock. You're looking at probably around $100 per cubic meter to purchase the rock and have it placed by a contractor. So, some of these sites are going to have, if you have 3 truck and trailers, that's going to be, in rock alone, that'll be, sort of $5,000, $3,000, $4,000 of rock. That's without even placing it. So Rock is an expensive option, and it's not something that you can always get machinery access to your site to do. So in my mind, we need to try a lot of the other options first before we head down this path. So another photo from Brad Costin from AgVic. So we call this a rock ramp. So water flowing out through the paddock, straight down the rocks quite safely. This is working really well. So you will get a bit of grass grow on that ramp over time, and that's all great. So they can work and they can be really successful. They're just expensive to construct. So the fourth point here for managing your gully is that if you've got gully erosion, one of the things that you can try and do is retain sediment close to the source where it's generated. So immediately downstream of your gully head, you might like to construct some silt traps or plant vegetation. And the aim of that is to actually catch that sediment before it moves further down the system. So that'll prevent it flowing into your dam or flowing into the waterway at the receiving end of your gully. So you can also construct some small grade control structures along the reach to actually act like little weirs, if you like, and to start to catch sediment behind those. And they'll also help to slow the flow, which will further help to capture sediment. So there's a lot of things that we can use off our property that will work without us having to go and purchase, expensive things. So timber in its simplest form, timber, forms a great sediment trap. So just at the bottom of the screen here, you can see, that tree root or bit of timber that's laying in here has got all this sediment that's been captured at various points behind it. So this wasn't even deliberate placement of timber. This is just in a paddock where there is some sheet erosion. So retaining timber on your property and using it to your advantage is a really good and cheap way to start capturing some of that sediment before it flows into your dam. Because of the construction industry and the need to minimise sediment running off building sites, there are actually now a lot of good products available that can work to capture sediment. So in the foreground here, this one's called a siltworm, and it's actually a hessian bag filled with straw from memory. So you can drive some metal pegs in that actually hold these in place, and it's probably only about 15 centimetres high, and it'll slow water coming down through this site and catch sediment. We start to get sediment build up behind them, and eventually over time that hessian will rot away. Further upstream here, these big round logs are called coir logs. So coir being coconut fibre. So it's basically, a waste product from the coconut industry. So they're woven, there's like a woven cover on these, and they're stuffed with this husk. And these will last for years at a site. And they perform in the same way. You can get them 3 metres long and 5 metres long. They're about 30 centimetres high. You can secure them with a wooden timber post or a star picket, and they work in exactly the same way. So you can wedge them. They're quite bendable. You can wedge them into different shapes to catch your sediment and stop it running off through your gully. The other thing you can do is to construct a sediment fence. So star pickets, you can use wire, you can use bits of shade cloth, but in a really high energy system, enough water can't pass through this shade cloth. So sometimes just chicken wire and some sticks piled up against the fence will start to catch some of that sediment before it runs further downstream. And it is another way to actually monitor how much sediment you have moving through your system, because you can look before and after different rainfall events and see what's actually built up at the site and measure a depth of sediment at the fence. That'll start to give you a feel for how active your gully is. We talked about the brush ramp before. This is very similar. If you already have quite a defined channel, you can just use brushing as roughness to catch sediment anywhere in your gully or your waterway. So just like, prunings out of the garden, things like bottle brush and tea tree work really well. So the ends of things, or the ends of eucalypt branches. If you've had a tree fall down in your paddock, you could go around and just chainsaw off all of the smaller diameter material on the end and just actually lay it through the bed of the channel you want the stick end pointing upstream and the head of the tree facing downstream. And what happens is it just progressively slows flow, builds up more sediment behind it, start to get grass growing. So it's just another way to add some roughness to your system. In a similar fashion, you can do these little one rock dams, if you like. So basically one rock high, like a block, a small little weir running across the channel, placed by hand. We need to make sure that the rock does go up the sides of the gully or the channel a little bit. So we don't want to keep it too low because we don't want to create erosion on the edges of the banks. And I'll show you a picture on the next slide of this actually in place. So these can act just like little sediment traps. So you get all this fine material deposit behind them. And then over time, you can start to get vegetation established in the bottom. So sedges, rushes, shrubs, trees, they'll all start to grow in that. And as these plants grow, they'll contribute more organic matter, more leaf litter. And over time, we hope that the bed through this system will actually stabilize up. So these little low level rock ramps or rock weirs might be a good option for you. Up in Queensland, they do a lot of work with what they call porous check dams. It's not something I've used in Victoria, but I think it's got possible application here. So they basically make a round tube out of chicken wire and they fill it with a whole lot of smaller branches and sticks and material. And then they basically install it perpendicular to the direction of flow along the gully and secure it with some star pickets. And it basically forms like it's a leaky weir in form. So water will pass through the wire and through the timber, but you should be capturing some of the grass and the sediment behind the check dam. And over time, that we hope that the bed will actually fill up a little bit higher. So I've got a really good little movie to show you again. It's the Leaky Weirs movie from the Malone Institute. I'll just get this going to you and you can have a bit of a watch. It talks very much, it's a nice little summary of what we've just talked about now, about the formation of these gullies and how to repair them.
You haven't shared your screen yet, Sally?
Yep.
All good.
Swampy meadows and chunks of ponds. Vegetation flourished along the waterways, which captured sediments, gradually built up soils in the valley floors. Moisture is stored within the floodplain, where plants can easily reach the water table. During dry times, water flow remains beneath the surface. In wet times, the flow spread out across the floodplain, and valuable nutrients were captured and recycled by the dense vegetation. Rich, fertile floodplains were widespread. When European settlers arrived, they found the dense native grasslands and abundant water ideal for sheep and cattle production. However, the new farming practices had major impacts on the fragile Australian environment and dramatically changed how water moved through the landscape. Trees were cleared and grasslands were raised to the ground, removing the very vegetation that slowed the water flow and built fertile floodplains in the first place. The water picked up speed when the landscape began to erode. Incisions cut deeply into the fertile soils, taking the nutrients and sediments with it. The newly formed erosion channels acted as drains, dropping the water table to the channel floor and drying out the wetlands. The continuous channels concentrated and increased water flow. Very little vegetation remained to slow down the floods, and more nutrients were lost downstream rather than being deposited on the floodplain. At the Marine Institute, we strive to restore landscape function, carefully plan and design structures to fit neatly into the landscape. One example is the leaky weir. These leaky weirs are built from natural materials such as rocks, logs, soil, and importantly, vegetation, which among other things, binds the structures together. The structures are designed to raise the water level of the stream and to slow and filter the flow, giving it a chance to infiltrate and recharge the groundwater. Coupled with improved land management, these rehydrated landscapes provide more reliable stream flows and improved water quality. During wet times, the flow spreads out across the floodplain, dry times, the water flow remains beneath the surface and replenishes the creek. This allows for enhanced agricultural productivity and improved conditions for wildlife. It gives us rehydrated landscapes that are more resilient to climatic extremes.
All right. I think that's a really good summary of the process of formation of what's happened in a lot of our gullies and waterways. I'll just share this next movie with you. And we'll go with, this is actually how to install a straw bale sediment trap, which I think is a really useful thing because it's quite a cheap exercise.
The site chosen for this example is a gully, a small catchment, approximately 3 hectares. Gully erosion is active, with soil being lost from the sides and the gully floor, and sediment being delivered into a small farm area. Ensure that your chosen site for the sediment trap is flat and wide at the gully base and that the gully sides are gradually sloping. Before starting, measure up the site to ensure you have plenty of straw bales to stand the gully floor and also up the gully sides. Once happy with the position of the bales, mark out where you will dig the trench. Remove the bales so you can dig a trench about 3 inches deep along the length of the sediment trap. Use hand tools such as mattocks or shovels to excavate the soil. Not been lucky. Make sure the trench base is flat so the bales sit snugly in the trench. Next, place the bales into the trench and butt them up against your zone so there are no gaps between the bales. Here, we're using 2-foot long galvanised star pickers to securely hold the bales into the trench. Place some of the trench soil against the straw bales to help create a good seal. Once done, use the flat end of the crowbar to help tamp in the soil around the edges of the bales. You need to go along all edges of the bales, including the sides. Impacting the edges will help ensure that water doesn't undermine the sediment trap. So once finished, the straw bales should be flat across the top like a weir, and ensure that water flows over the centre of the sediment trap and not around the sides. Check your sediment trap under flowing conditions to make sure water isn't undermining the bales. Make sure you place a mixture of small and large rocks immediately downstream of the straw bales to ensure the water flowing over the crest of the weir doesn't cause any erosion. If working properly, you'll notice that sediment is deposited behind the straw bales after water has drained away. After a few years, the straw bales can be expected to deteriorate and your ability to store sediment will be reduced.
I think that's a great little clip that shows us exactly what we can do with just 4 bales of lucerne. And it would be quite possible that you could build multiple of those all the way down so that you capture sediment at a range of places, you know, at different slopes along your gully. So just a final slide, some other things to consider. Please don't dump your rubbish in gullies because it doesn't work to stabilise them. Bricks and broken concrete might work and that's okay, but wire typically does not help the cause and just makes it really hard to remediate those gullies down the track. And old fridges certainly don't work either. So try and avoid dumping your rubbish in the gullies. It's a bit of an old school thing that I think we used to do to put it out of mind, but it's not going to help your situation. rabbit control is absolutely essential. If you have gullies on your property and you have rabbits, you need to get in and do something about the rabbits, because particularly in areas with dispersible soils, single rabbit burrows can create all sorts of problems for you on your property. So that's not just, I guess it's something you need to work with your neighbours as well. And you could have a talk to your local land care group about a more catchment or local area sort of program, but rabbit control is really important at these sites. And my third point here is probably something that I've learnt along the way from looking at a lot of our older sites from 80s and 90s, is to avoid using fixed structures like pipes and shaped concrete and weirs and things like that aren't flexible, because often you know, those things get outflanked, water flows around the edge and your pipe becomes irrelevant. It's really hard to concentrate flow safely to one area without causing further problems. So, you know, things that are, you know, the main objective is actually to disperse flow over a wider area rather than concentrating it into little narrow pipes and things and moving it around. It's just a less risky approach, I think. So here's an example of what not to do. Outdoor chairs don't really work where you've got tunnel erosion and big gullies like this. So that's really not going to help the situation at all. It's not going to provide, it's certainly not going to assist. It might catch some sediment, that would be about all, but it's not going to slow the formation of that gully. So just as a recap, please be really proactive in managing your risky areas on your property. So those areas that get really wet and boggy on steep drainage lines are going to be key areas where gullies can develop. At the first signs of erosion and even just small bare areas of ground, you know, remove your stock and pop up a temporary fence. That might, if you run electric fencing, that could be, you know, some stakes and just some tape just to keep cattle off for the winter, and then see and reassess over summer at that site. Vegetation, predominantly grass, is absolutely essential for stabilising these sites and preventing them from developing further. Please assess and monitor the site before you make decisions on what needs to happen there in terms of management. So repeat photos, go out when it's wet, have a look at the water actually flowing through those sites, or do some measurements of whether that erosion head is retreating, because that's going to give you really good information to help guide what future works are needed at the site. So the earlier that you can treat your sites, you are likely to have more success, and it's going to cost you less. So getting in as soon as these things start to develop is going to give you the best chance of fixing them. And I've just popped in 4 sources of more information. So the Agriculture Victoria website, the Malone Institute website, we saw the little clip on leaky weirs from them earlier, is good. The Greta Valley Landcare Group website has got a lot on managing gullies and erosion control. And there's so much available via, you know, doing a Google search. You'll pull up sites in Queensland, New South Wales, WA. All of that's relevant and will assist your understanding of what you might be able to do at your site. So I think that's all for now, Penny. Thank you for having me, everybody. If you have any questions, you feel free to get in touch. Penny can provide my email address and phone number if you need it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally. That was fantastic. Also, feel free to contact the Edi Black Range Landcare Catchment Group if you would like any more information or support. We're always looking to support our local landholders in these kind of endeavours, so please reach out. We've got a Facebook page, and if you just Google the group, you'll be able to find the relevant contact details. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks again, Sally. Bye.
Bye-bye.